a good day so far. Today we'll be doing our grade 8 English lesson on pronouns. So we'll be doing our grade 8 English lesson on pronouns. And before we start with our lesson on pronouns, we're going to log into aplusstudents.ca. And we're going to log in with our username as well as our password. Once you've logged in with our username as well as our password, and then we're going to select the subject of language arts. And then grade 8. Once we've selected the subject of language arts, grade 8, we're going to scroll down up until we get to the chapter of pronouns. And in our previous lessons, we did quite a few. We did a few lessons on pronouns, right? And different types of pronouns, identifying pronouns and the antecedents, and using reflective pronouns, right? So today we are going to choose between personal and reflexive pronouns, as well as is the pronouns reflexive or intensive. So we are going to look at that before we basically conclude with our chapter on pronouns, right? All right. So our chapter for today is pronouns. The subject is English language arts, grade 8. And the lessons that we are focusing on today is to choose between personal and reflexive pronouns, as well as is the pronouns reflexive or intensive. And we are doing our tutorial lesson on aplusstudents.ca, right? All right, so we're going to continue now. And like I say, in our previous lessons, we focused on quite a few different topics under pronouns. And today we're going to conclude on those topics, specifically reflexive pronouns, as well as choosing between reflexive and personal pronouns, right? And is the pronouns reflexive or intensive? All right, so now we're going to start. So a reflexive pronoun, right? Or reflexive pronouns are pronouns that ends either in self or selves. So that is called a reflexive pronoun. So reflexive pronouns, it's pronouns that end in self or selves. It's like saying myself, herself, himself. If we say it in a plural form, then we can say it is yourselves, ourselves, themselves, right? So it means that if we just use the word self, right, then self is basically when it is a singular subject, right? It refers to it being a singular subject. But as soon as we make mention of selves, then this is a plural subject, right? So it's in a plural form. Because if we just say self, then it's like over here where it says subject that is singular, right? Then we just say I, which is myself. I'm referring to myself. This is I, this is me. And I'm referring to myself. If I'm referring to you, right? then that is yourself, right? Make yourself a sandwich. You should do it. You should make yourself a sandwich. She and herself. He refers to himself and it refers to itself. And these are all singular subjects and it refers to one person or thing. Then we have our plural subjects, right? It's in a plural form. It's like we are talking about we, right? We are doing that, right? Ourselves. We will do it ourselves. We will do it ourselves. And as you can see, you, right, can refer to it being either singular or it can be referred to as in a plural form, right? You yourself or you yourselves and they themselves. And as you can see, these are all plural subjects referring to something which is more than two, like two or more things. So that is plural. And like we say, these are all reflexive pronouns. And reflexive pronouns are pronouns that either end in self, which is refers to a singular subject, or it ends in selves, which refers to a plural subject. And then also a reflexive pronoun is used to refer back to the subject of the sentence or clause in which it happens. And it needs to agree with the subject. So reflexive pronoun is used to refer back to the subject of the sentence. So if the subject is I, you, she, he, it, then it means that we need to refer back to I, myself, back to you, yourself, back to she, which is herself, back to he, which is himself, or back to it, which is itself. Right? Now, if we look at an example, let me just read. So if we look at an example, right, where we say a reflexive pronoun is used to refer back to the subject of the sentence, right? Or in the clause in which it appears, and it needs to agree with the subject. So we basically say, we helped ourselves to some soup, right? So we helped ourselves to some soup. So it's basically asking who helped themselves to soup. So you can say it's we, which is us. We helped ourselves to some soup, right? So basically it's agreeing back to the subject, which is we, because we are doing it. We are helping ourselves. So the subject within the sentence is we. This is our subject. So it needs to refer back to the subject. So if we is our subject, then it means that we use ourselves. And after the guests left, Amy made herself a cup of tea. Amy made herself a cup of tea. So which means that after the guests left, Amy made herself. Amy made herself a cup of tea. So there we have Amy, which can also refer to as she, and then herself. Amy made a cup of tea. Amy made herself a cup of tea. It's like saying she made herself a cup of tea, right? Which means that Amy is basically just the noun, she's not the pronoun. The pronoun is she. So the pronoun is she, and in this case, herself is basically referring back to a noun, not the pronoun. And these are basically your reflexive pronouns. So we are now going to go back to, or we're going to aplusstudents.ca, and then we're going to choose between personal and reflexive pronouns, as well as to identify is the pronoun reflexive or intensive. So we're going to choose between personal and reflexive pronoun. And we literally went over reflexive pronouns that end in self or selves. And we made mention of singular subject reflexive pronouns, which is I, myself, you, yourself, she, herself, him, himself, it itself. And then we have our plural subject reflexive pronouns, which is we ourselves, you yourself, or they themselves. And now, a reflexive pronoun is used to refer back, like we said, to the subject of the sentence or clause in which it appears, right? And we made mention of that. And we say that it should agree with the subject. And usually you will find the subject at the beginning of the sentence. You will mainly find the subject at the beginning of the sentence. For example, right? Because remember, it needs to a reflexive pronoun, right? It's the pronoun. So it says that we must have said this is the subject, right? So we said this is the subject. We helped ourselves to more soup, and this is our reflexive. To more soup. So basically, it is referring back to the subject. Ourselves, meaning that we helped ourselves to get some soup. So the subject of that sentence is we. So we use ourselves. And after the guest left, Amy made herself a cup of tea. So Amy and herself. So Amy made herself a cup of tea. And over here it says the subject of the clause in which the pronoun appears is Amy. And like we said, Amy is basically just the noun, but Amy can also be called she. So we can call Amy she, because Amy is currently the noun, but we can call Amy she. Because after the guest left, Amy made herself a cup of tea. It's the same as saying after the guest left, she made herself a cup of tea. Right? So which means that Amy can be called a she. So we still use herself, which means that this is a reflexive pronoun because we can refer back to the subject. And then a reflexive pronoun can only be used to refer to the subject, right, of the sentence or clause in which it appears. which means that a reflexive pronoun can only be used to refer to the subject of the sentence, the subject of the sentence or clause in which it appears. So it needs to refer back to the subject. And to refer to someone else or something else, a personal pronoun like me, you, him, her, it, us, or them should be used instead. So if you basically want to refer to something else or someone else, right, and then you can use a personal pronoun like me, you, him, her, it, us, or them. However, our reflexive pronouns, right, like herself, himself, itself, it refers back to the subject within the sentence. Then we have Jake wrote a note for himself. So Jake is our subject. So Jake is our subject and wrote a note for himself, right? And himself is referring back to Jake because we can say he wrote a note to himself. So we can basically then say Jake can also be identified as he. And that is a reflexive pronoun. The pronoun can be he, which refers to Jake, wrote a note for himself. Himself. And the reflexive pronoun himself refers back to the subject Jake. And Jake wrote a note for him. So over here it says Jake wrote a note for him. So if we say Jake wrote a note for him, then him over here refers to a pronoun. Because himself is reflexive or reflexive pronoun. But if we just say that Jake wrote a note to him or to her or to us or to them, then that is a pronoun. It's a personal pronoun because it's referring to someone else other than the subject. Because we are not saying Jake wrote a note to him. Who is the him? Him can be anybody else. It can be Jake wrote a note to Patrick. Jake wrote a note to James, right? So it means that he's writing it to someone else. But as soon as you write it to yourself, himself, myself, ourselves, then we are referring back to to the subject, and then that is a reflexive pronoun. But in this case, Jake wrote a note to him. Him refers to somebody else, which means that this is a personal pronoun because it's referring to someone else other than the subject. All right, do we understand? Do you want me to explain some more? Or can we move along? All right, let's move on. Now we're going to do an activity. Select the best pronoun to complete the sentence. So we need to select the best pronoun to complete the sentence. Wrap around spiders, hide during the day by wrapping around twigs. Let me see what is the. So here they're saying it is wraparound spiders can be called they. So basically they, which are the wraparound spiders, they hide during the day by wrapping around twigs or wrapping themselves around twigs. So basically, once again, we can say wraparound spiders refers to them or they. So we can say they hide during the day by wrapping themselves around twigs. All right. Here it says select the best pronoun to complete the sentence. After the game, the tennis player criticized himself for his weak serve. So after the game, the tennis player criticized himself for his weak serves. So the tennis player, we can even say he. We can substitute the tennis player with he criticized himself for the weak serves. He, which means that the tennis player, we can basically say this is going to be he criticize himself so he criticized himself for his weak serve. And like we said, the tennis player, we can basically substitute that word with he. And then himself refers back to the pronoun he. All right, now let's go to our test. We need to select the best pronoun to complete the sentence. So we need to select the best pronoun to complete the sentence. He impressed. Do we say he impressed me with his knowledge of Greek myths and legends, or he impressed myself with his knowledge of Greek myths and legends? All right, so if we choose the correct one, we can say he impressed me because he and myself does not go hand in hand unless it was I myself, right? So, but in this case, we can say he impressed me with his knowledge of Greek myths and legends, which means that me, it also refers to someone else that he is trying to impress. And this is a personal pronoun. So well done, me is correct. She summoned ourselves, or she summoned us to the conference room for an emergency meeting with the president of the company. So she summoned ourselves, or she summoned us to the conference room for an emergency meeting with the president of the company. All right, so we can say she summoned us. Yes, she summoned us to the conference room for an emergency meeting with the president of the company. So we can say she summoned us. And us is correct. So well done. Us is correct, and that is a personal pronoun. For this assignment, should we measure us in inches or centimeters? Or for this assignment, should we measure ourselves in inches or centimeters? So we can say for this assignment, should we measure us in inches or centimeters, or should we measure ourselves in inches or centimeters? We need to find the best pronoun. All right. Okay, so yeah, it says, right, for this assignment, should we measure us or should we measure ourselves in inches or centimeters? Usually, we say the we, it refers to ourselves, right? So we, ourselves, let us try ourselves because in this case, the ourselves, it refers back to we, right? Because we is the subject. But let's see, because sometimes it can be very tricky if we write, let's say it can be tricky between personal pronouns as well as reflexive pronouns. But ourselves is correct because ourselves refers back to we, which is the subject. So well done, guys. So ourselves is correct. This weekend, I am dedicating to taking care of the chores that have piled up. So this weekend, I am dedicating, do we say I am dedicating myself or I'm dedicating me to taking care of the chores that I've piled up. So this weekend, I am dedicating myself, or I am dedicating me to taking care of the chores. And over here, we have I, which is the subject. And remember, if we are choosing the reflexive pronoun, then the reflexive pronoun needs to be able to refer back to the subject, which is I. And can it do that? Yes, because I myself. So we can say, I am dedicating myself to taking care of the chores that have piled up. Because you are referring back to yourself. You are not referring to someone else. And myself is correct. So well done. Myself is correct. Well done, guys. And to protest the logging of old growth forests, demonstrators stationed outside the Capitol building. So to protest the logging of old growth protests, demonstrators stationed themselves outside the Capitol building or herself outside the Capitol building. So we can then say to protest the logging of old growth forest, demonstrators stationed themselves outside the Capitol building because the demonstrators, right, it can refer to as they stationed themselves outside the Capitol building. And themselves is correct. All right. And then after the game, the tennis player criticized himself or criticized itself for his weak serves. So we can say after the game, the tennis player criticized himself for his weak serves. And himself is correct. Well done, guys. Himself is correct. All right, so now we're going to is the pronoun reflexive or intensive, right? And we said reflexive pronouns, it refers back to the subject of the sentence or clause in which they appear, and they are always the objects of the verb or preposition. For example, did Sarah save any of the cookies for herself? So So, for example, we said, did Sarah save any cookies for herself? So, Sarah and herself, or herself, refers back to Sarah. Because the same as we can say, did she save any cookies for herself? And over here, the reflexive pronoun refers, herself refers back to the subject, which is Sarah, right? And that is the object of preposition for. All right, so we basically made mention of reflexive pronouns, and we said that with the reflexive pronoun, your reflexive pronoun needs to refer back to the subject of that sentence, right? And the subject of that sentence is the object of the preposition within that sentence, right? So now we go to intensive pronouns, and intensive pronouns, like for example, myself, it emphasizes on the pronoun which is I, right? So myself refers to I, which is the pronoun. Itself refers to it as the pronoun. So after waiting in line all afternoon, we were finally able to meet the queen herself. So which means that that is an intensive line all afternoon. So after waiting in line all afternoon, we were finally able to meet the queen. And we said this is intensive pronoun herself that emphasizes the noun queen. And one way to tell if a pronoun is either reflexive or if it is intensive is to try and replacing it with an object pronoun. For example, like me, her, or us. And if you can replace it with an object pronoun and it still have a complete sentence, then it's reflexive. But if you can't, it is intensive pronoun. For example, did Sarah save any cookies for herself? Or did Sarah save any of the cookies for him? So in this case, we can say herself refers back to Sarah, right? Because it's like, have you saved any cookies for as Sarah save any cookies for herself? So she's referring back to herself. But yeah, it says Sarah saved. Did Sarah save any of the cookies for him? Him refers to someone else, which means that this is not a reflexive pronoun. All right. Now let us do an activity. It says Mr. Pet introduced himself to us and welcomed us to the neighborhood. Is this a reflexive pronoun or intensive pronoun? So himself refers basically back to Mr. Pet, right? So himself refers back to Mr. Pet, which means that it is a reflexive pronoun. Now we're going on to our test. It says, is the pronoun in bold either reflexive or is it intensive? So we can say Andrew uses an elaborative system of notes to remind himself of what he has to do. So is it the reflexive pronoun or is it the intensive pronoun? Andrew uses an elaborative system notes to remind himself of what he has to do. So in this case, himself refers back to the subject, which is Andrew, because he's reminding himself of what he was doing, not to somebody else. So we can say this is a reflexive pronoun because himself refers back to Andrew, which is basically him. And it's a reflexive. So well done. Yes, the first one is correct. Well done, guys. We are now here ourselves, he said as he shook his hand. So we are now here, he said as he shook his hand. Is that intensive or is that reflexive pronoun? So we are here are now we are new year, sorry. We are new year ourselves. He said as he shook my hand. So is this now intensive or is this reflexive? So we are new year ourselves. We are new year ourselves. He said as he shook my hand. Is that intensive or reflexive? All right, let us see. Everybody's choosing intensive. Let us choose intensive, right? And that is correct. So well done. Intensive is correct. The tourist found herself in an unfamiliar neighborhood and pulled out her map. So the tourist found herself in an unfamiliar neighborhood and pulled out her map. Is this reflexive or is this intensive? So we can say that the tourist found herself in an unfamiliar neighborhood and pulled out a map. All right, let us say, because herself refers to the tourist, right? And that is a reflexive pronoun. So well done, guys. That is now the end of our lesson on pronouns. And literally, like for the few, let's say for the few days that we've been lessons, chapters that we've been doing pronouns, we basically identified subject or object pronouns, antecedents. But in this case, for today, we were able to identify between personal pronouns as well as reflexive and intensive pronouns, right? Remember, reflexive pronoun, it refers back to the subject, and a reflexive pronoun refers to or it ends in self or selves, whether singular or plural. All right. So, grade 8, thank you very much for joining the class. And I really hope you're going to have an amazing day further. Goodbye.